everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hello, Rob. It's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie.
I just want us all to take a moment. I feel like it's been a long year, and I think, you know what, sometimes it's good on these podcasts, whether you're a podcast about soup or a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, like this one, to just take a moment and feel the podcast microphone. Just really get up on there. Rub your face on it. Just feel it all. Have a mindful moment with your microphone. Are you all doing that now?
Yep, I love my microphone.
Okay, good. And now...
I want to know more about the soup podcast.
Oh, well, it's a joint venture of me and Campbell's we're going to put together.
I could talk about soup for like kind of a long time,
just
I think.
Review soups.
Now that I think about it.
I want to put the soup in my mouth and just like hold it and think about the process of opening the can of soup, dumping it in a...
What? That's not how you make soup.
Dump it in a bowl.
Sorry. You work for Campbell's. You're a Campbell's shill, so that is how you make soup.
Put it in the microwave, press each button.
Okay.
In case you couldn't tell, everybody, having a mindful moment about everything today.
Oh my God.
To prepare for our topic, which is mindfulness. Mindfulness. I wish I had some sort of like echo. I don't know if you guys get that feeling when you hear someone talk about echo. Yes. You sort of want like a mindfulness. I mean, like this weird like echo vibe, because I feel like mindfulness is one of those. I don't know if movement is the right terms, but kind of treatment components or a component of a lot of new treatment packages that feels very new agey and therefore probably not scientific. However, we are here tonight to discuss research related to mindfulness. And how can there be research published on mindfulness if there's absolutely no science behind it? And spoiler alert, all of our articles are not. Mindfulness is not scientific. So we'll be talking all about some mindfulness research, which again, I think, spoiler alert for the episode, will go down sort of as similar to gamification. We did an episode on gamification a while back in terms of a treatment that totally seems effective and seems like a really great avenue to explore. Why does it work? But it seems to work. And that's where I think researchers and continuing to follow the research really comes in, and why I'm really excited that we get to talk all about mindfulness today. So why don't I start by listing the articles that we will be discussing. Everybody ready?
I'm ready.
I'm clicking the link right now, clicking it to see what it says. All right. That's enough of that. So we'll be discussing preliminary evidence on the efficacy of mindfulness combined with traditional classroom management strategies by Casson and Wilson from Behavior Analysis and Practice 2017, which is actually an article that we discussed way back when in episode 33, I think, on classroom management. But we sort of included it because it's a replication of another article we'll be discussing. Effects of mindfulness-based interventions on disruptive behavior, a meta-analysis of single-case research by Klingbeil, Fischer, Renshaw, Bloomfield, Polakoff, Willenbrink, Copek, and Chan from Psychology in the Schools to 2017. Mindfulness training and classroom behavior among lower income and ethnic minority elementary school children by Black and Fernando from the Journal of Child and Family Studies, 2014. And finally, a mindfulness approach to improving classroom attention by Wilson and Dixon from the Journal of Behavioral Health and Medicine, 2010.
Issue number 1.
Of
that journal.
Start off with a bang. Mindfulness and a Mark Dixon article.
I always wanted to be in the issue number 1.
I know, right?
Of something. You just make your own journal.
It could still happen.
That's
so
hard
the easiest
to
way
plan.
to do it is to just make your own journal.
Yeah. It would be really hard to plan, like, to be in the issue 1 of the year.
I don't know how that happens.
Oh, you want to be the first of a year? I thought you wanted to be in like the first issue of a brand new journal.
No, just the first of the year.
Oh, gotcha. This is the first volume. I guess that's what I meant to say. I get those mixed up all the time. Mm-hmm. Volume 1. Is that right?
Sure. You're the published researcher, Diana. What do I know about this?
I'm bad at those. It doesn't matter.
No. So, you know what? That's okay. Let's live in the now. Okay. It doesn't matter. Let's just sit here with how little that matters. So mindfulness.
I'm over it.
You're over it? Okay, let's move on.
Okay.
Let's talk about mindfulness. Why don't we start by just talking about mindfulness in general? Because again, I know if you're like me, the first time I heard about mindfulness, it sounded like a load of hooey that someone had just made up after they went to a yoga class and they were like, I bet I could write a book about this stuff and make a lot of money. And a lot of gullible people will be like, I heard mindfulness is great. Have you heard about mindfulness? And it would go on to sell 1 billion copies. And then 5 years from now, everyone would be like, remember mindfulness? What a joke that was. Nobody uses mindfulness anymore. Let's chalk it up with our list of failed interventions. But it is something that is much older than I think some of the recent publications. I know there was a period when you could go to Target and just like go to Target and like hang out at Target for a while. And you'd always see like a Life magazine or Time magazine special on mindfulness. And it was there for like a full year. Like mindfulness is like the biggest it was like the newest hotness. But mindfulness in terms of the practice of mindfulness it sort of stems from a lot of the work of meditation, though they're not the same thing. So it is something that's been around for a long time and sort of one of those more Eastern philosophical practices that we've sort of come to say, well, let's turn our Western science eye to it, and found that, yes, there are some real benefits to the practice of mindfulness. So a lot of the work that mindfulness sort of based interventions stems from a lot of work by Dr. Kabat-Zinn, who sort of, was one of the earlier discussants of what is mindfulness in terms of a psychological intervention.
I'm sorry, is this person's last name Zen?
Kabat-Zinn.
Oh, okay.
Like a Kabat-Zinn.
I thought his first name was Kabat and his last name was Zen.
No.
That would have been too perfect.
I would end this episode and be like, I don't trust this mindfulness. I don't care who wrote an article about it. That's the guy's name.
He was like, my last name is Zen, so I think I should make mindfulness be about Zen. That's how I get my trademark into the world.
He's like, I didn't choose a mindfulness knife. The mindfulness knife chose me.
No.
Okay, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
That's okay. And when we talk about mindfulness, we're generally talking about this sort of idea of, can we turn our attention to the present moment? So the stimuli that are occurring in the present moment, while, this is a quote, simultaneously regulating the quality of one's attention to such stimuli. Or in other words, again, another quote, Kabat-Zinn quote, paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So if you're a practitioner who has been interested in ACT or who uses ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, you are probably very familiar with mindfulness, because while mindfulness and ACT are not synonymous, mindfulness is often a component of ACT.
Sure. So if we were to translate that behavior analytically, we would say you're looking to maybe tact some of your covert perceptions about either the world around you or your own body and physicality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. It's a skill that one can learn to do. It's, again, not meditation, which really refers to the idea that you are focusing on some sort of a mantra or like an expression. Mindfulness has more to do with being present in the moment. So, like you said, Dana, I'm directly attending. I'm purposefully attending to the stimuli in my environment, whether they're external or internal. And I'm not... I think when we're sort of, if you start thinking about your own private events, you sort of start having your own private verbal behavior about those private events. Like, now I'm thinking about this. Oh, that reminds me, I should, and you sort of let your mind, quote unquote, wander. And when we're talking about mindfulness, we're not doing that. It's just what is happening in the moment. So it's dealing with a lot of sensations. So you're tacting the sensations, you're tacting your private events. And that's really it. You're accepting that they're there. You're not then going off on sort of a path. If you do, you kind of come back to those sensations. So again, if you're watching someone practice mindfulness, it really just looks like somebody who's really just taking a long freaking time with everything. Hurry it up, which is one of the reasons I don't think I practice mindfulness and will have a hard time practicing mindfulness if I choose to do so.
It's like doing Kegels. No one necessarily knows if you're doing them.
This is a family podcast.
Diana, wow.
Sorry, it seems apt. It's an apt comparison. Okay. Well, to your point, though, I was just about to say, do you think that this is easier for some people than others right off the bat? And or is it something you can learn to be better at?
Much like Master Yoda says, I'm always never aware of where I am. I'm always looking towards the future.
Did Yoda say that?
Something like that. I paraphrase that. It's an Empire Strikes Back.
In my article, they talk about it as a trainable skill.
Right.
So I think that there are people that have types of fine-grained units of behavior that make moving slower and being more mindful in quotation marks. It might be easier for them, right? Because they've had more of a history with those types of contingencies and maybe potentially being reinforced for that type of behavior, whereas other people may not have had that type of behavior in their repertoire, and that might be extraordinarily challenging for them.
That makes sense. Because I think about you, Robin.
Thank you.
I didn't say how I thought of you yet. But I feel like just synaptically you move so fast that I could see how if you were to attempt this, that your brain would just jump in a way that might be more challenging to kind of like get a wrangle on than someone like me, who if I attempt to meditate, I'd usually just fall asleep. Yeah. So I kind of slow down too much.
And then you have me, the happy medium.
Yeah. You're great at this, Jax.
I am really good at mindfulness, but still have, more work to do. But I have worked quite a bit on slowing down and being thoughtful of things that I'm doing. It takes a lot of work, right? You have to add in contingencies in your environment. Although some of it is automatically reinforcing or the behavior itself is reinforcing, but it is better to add in external reinforcers, I think, initially, like doing it with a friend so they can be like, wow, you're doing a great job, to help you maintain that skill.
It does sort of strike me, as Skinner would say in verbal behavior, the idea that silence is often very aversive to people. I feel like mindfulness is just so much silence. So to me, the idea of, now you're going to take forever to eat this piece of candy. It's like, no, I already ate it. I need the next piece of candy now. The idea of forcing me to wait, the whole thing just sounds so painful to me. Not so much. I mean, I understand the benefits of it and why one would want to slow down or have those mindful practice moments. But you're right, Jack. It is not something that I would do because I find the practice of mindfulness on its own to have any real reinforcing value on any of my behaviors related to being mindful. It's just not going to happen. I would only do it if I thought there was some sort of long-term benefit that I could plan for, some long-term contingency.
So which again, there may be. What are the benefits?
Well, we're going to talk all about them, but
okay.
Well, the perceived benefits, the purported benefits. I did want to just quickly, while we're talking about the definition, I think in the Black article, there's a really nice description of thinking about or intentionally remembering to pay attention in the present moment without habitual reaction or conceptual exaggeration. And then they have a little IE, just continuing to have some sort of reactive, either cognitive or behavioral response or emotional response to what's going on, or you're just sort of elaborating on the thought. So again, this candy's delicious. Reminds me of this other time I had candy. Yum, yum, yum. That's not a mindful moment. That's you just thinking about the candy you're eating. Very different, even though they might outwardly look exactly the same. The issue we're going to run into with mindfulness and the mindfulness research is less about that mindfulness has no effect or it isn't useful in terms of treatment procedures. Usually mindfulness has been part of, I think some of the original mindfulness studies in the early 2000s or mid 2000s had to do with individuals with intellectual disabilities and aggression and disruptive behavior. And it has gone on to be a component of a lot of therapies related to, say, anxiety, depression. But it's increasingly being used nowadays in schools as part of sort of mindfulness interventions. And again, this always kind of raises I don't want to say my hackles exactly, but my red flags, in that schools tend to find things that sound really great and may not be super well researched. And they don't ask those critical questions all the time of, what is the purpose of this new intervention? How hard will it be to implement this new intervention? What are we even expecting to see when we implement this new intervention?
How will we know if it did anything?
Yeah, it's more just like, I saw it on Time Magazine. So mindfulness, everybody, that's what we're doing. How do you do it? And as Wilson and Dixon point out in their article, a challenge of a lot of mindfulness research, especially in the last decade, has been that mindfulness and mindfulness activities are really all over the place. There are so many different types of mindfulness activities. So I can't tell any of our listeners, so here's how you do mindfulness. Because again, while there are a lot of similarities between the different exercises, there are so many ways that one could practice mindfulness or include mindfulness in your behavior intervention plan, for example. So it makes it harder to replicate the research that's been done. And then to see, okay, if I replicate this research, do I get the same results with different populations? A lot of the populations, too, have changed. It started with a lot of individuals with intellectual disabilities, a lot of work with adults. There hasn't been as much research with young children or adolescents. So again, even though we've seen positive results with adults, is that going to carry over to results with younger people? It's been used a lot with individuals with behaviors maintained by negative reinforcement. That sort of seems to be this kind of a summary of a lot of the research, is that treatments in which you're trying to look at, say, anxiety, binge eating, PTSD, and then like part of ACT. So again, behaviors maintained by negative reinforcement, there tend to be some better results though it can also be used, or often is thought to be used. Let's use mindfulness as part of our increasing children's abilities in school.
When you say that, do you mean that you're going to use mindfulness as a replacement behavior that's a more appropriate method of escape, or as something that you use as an antecedent strategy to then make the aversive conditions less aversive?
I mean, I guess it's going to depend, again, on what type of therapy or program are you using. So for ACT, again, I'm not an expert on ACT, but you wouldn't be looking at making some of these situations that you're in. It's more about increasing your flexibility in responding to those situations.
Right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And you have to have done it repeatedly.
I would recommend doing it beforehand.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to make sure I was understanding what Rob was saying. Not like, oh, instead of having some other type of behavior to escape, why don't you do mindfulness?
It's not an FCR program.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I was on the right track.
You are totally on the right track.
I'm on the inside track.
Diana's coming with all of the zingers tonight.
So an example of an exercise is, I'm currently reading a book by Dr. Zarita on parenting a troubled teen, which is an ACT approach to working with your adolescent. So like a highly emotional adolescent. It had been recommended to me by an employee at the McLean's Hospital, which is a mental health facility in Massachusetts, as a good expression of ACT that parents could potentially use. And it sort of looks at mindfulness. It's just one chapter. So again, I think a lot of people think of ACT as, if they don't know ACT, it's mindfulness. They're the same thing. It's a component of. And some of the exercises that were in that book, and again, I was on the chapter on mindfulness and we were preparing for this episode, which was great. There were some exercises like the mindfulness of an emotional roller coaster, or the mindfulness of preparing a meal. And when you hear exercises like that, I'm sure some of you are like, what is this? That doesn't sound like stimulus equivalence or behavioral momentum. I don't know if I trust this. I agree with you. When I hear these exercises, they sound very loosey-goosey. They don't sound like what I would expect in like a treatment comparison.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that there's a couple ways to think about this, right? So we're looking at this as a potential antecedent strategy, but the question is, like, to what end, right? So if this is like an algebra equation, we have like our left-hand side of the equation equals big old question mark or X on the right-hand side. So there could be a couple different things that you're sort of working toward, and they could be defined in different ways. And likely there are dependent variables that are going to be binned either as something that is subjective or something that is objective. And if it's something that's subjective, it could be we're asking the person, how do you feel now that you did these mindfulness activities? Tell me on a scale of 1 to 10. And that's very valuable, but it is difficult to interpret behavior analytically because we only have so much access to how a person feels. But they're telling us how they feel, and that honestly should count for something. So there's that type of DV, but then there's also some type of objective DV that we're hoping to measure. And each of these studies kind of gets at that from a different angle. But to me, that's like the ultimate question here. If it's only going to be a subjective DV, that's valuable. But I also want to know, are there some objective changes to behavior or adaptive responses that can be attributed back to mindfulness?
And I know one of the places I keep seeing mindfulness as someone who works in schools is in this push for more social emotional learning, which again, like mindfulness, is one of those sort of somewhat poorly defined, in my opinion, poorly defined initiatives that has all these studies looking at when we pay attention to, children's ability to be self-aware and engage in self-management and have social awareness and build their relationship skills and responsible decision-making. These all sound great, don't they? We see improvements in their cognitive abilities and in their emotional well-being. Again, a lot of terms that all sound great.
Oh yeah, I'm on board.
But then when you try to find research on it, or like, well, so what are we going to do? It's like, well, what aren't we going to do? And to me, those don't feel like meaningful procedures. It just feels like so much of I'm going to make an intervention package. And, if I include everything in my intervention package, I bet I'll get great results, to which we all say, great, what did I do? And I can't replicate this because I don't actually know what the procedure was. So mindfulness is a key component of a lot of these social emotional learning programs that I've seen. And again, I don't want the audience and the listeners to be thinking that I hate social emotional learning and I hate mindfulness, because I feel like I'm coming off very negative. It's more, again, like gamification, where there's a sense of something's working. What? And from my perspective, so many people are focusing on but something worked, let's just start doing it, that it gives me real pause. It gives me that, that bad feeling in the pit of your stomach, like, hold on, this is not going to end as well as I think we all want it to, because nobody is quite aware of the mechanisms. what is going on here with mindfulness, with social emotional learning. So again, it's really a matter of, it's so exciting to get a chance to look at research because it gives you some of the answers. I found our research for this episode gave us some of the answers, though not all of the answers, which again is true about almost everything.
I can't believe that we didn't find all of the answers.
I know. You think we get like an hour and 15 minutes, we get everything answered.
One thing that I was a little bit disappointed of, and that kind of hits yours, is that only one of the article that we talked about a published curriculum, and the rest of them were just like mindfulness strategies, which I think might be a little harder to replicate in a larger setting, right? So might be harder to be like, hey, teachers, this school, we're going to do mindfulness. Here it is, right? I think when I read the other articles, I felt a little sad that they didn't pick something that was already established to test it out.
I agree, Jackie. But in so much of, I think a theme that we see in research, it's a funny thing, we do the show long enough, you see all these themes in research, is if you create a treatment for some group to use, I'm thinking of our episode on dental, improving dental outcomes or dental visit outcomes, and you make some great treatment and it's super effective and from our opinion, super easy to run. But as long as it requires any work whatsoever, the social validity just goes down the tubes. It's like, no, could you create a behavior plan in which I did nothing and everything just happened to work out? And not to knock any professional who that being their opinion, because I think it's true. It's like, no, I was hired to do job X, not to do behavior management. That's why I called you, BCBA. So what do you got? Like, you need to solve the problem for me. And I think this is true for schools. And when we talk about mindfulness, it's let's all do mindfulness. And if that's the only guidance one gets, it's like, okay, I'll do that when you're watching me, or I'll try it out. And then I'll probably stop doing it because what are the reinforcers involved in my using this thing where I kind of feel like I'm making it up? There's not necessarily a published curriculum that I'm using. Right. I'm just having the kids eat candy all day. Like, what? I don't want to use this anymore.
In my study, they eat oranges. So you could easily come away with that, oh, you need to eat oranges in order to do mindfulness, right?
I've seen Starbursts being used as well. Those are good ones.
Right. So there could be concerns about variation in treatment integrity if there's not something solid. That's
only oranges work. Starbursts they're not a mindful food. I don't know what. Yeah, we're joking. We have no clue. So, with that being said, most of the studies we're talking about today are looking at mindfulness as a component of a kind of a package intervention to some extent, where, we do have a body of research looking at how do these treatments work for adults. And it does seem like in the research for adults that there are a lot of positive outcomes. But again, what are the outcomes? They sort of change from paper to paper. What are the procedures? They change from paper to paper, which if you're saying, I don't know about this mindfulness stuff, I think that's the right attitude to have. Seems promising, but really is probably the attitude that you should be going into the research. And then you can make your own judgments based on what you're able to read. We're only going over 4 papers tonight, so it's not going to be everything. With that being said, any other opening mindfulness statements anyone would like to make before we get into the articles?
I'm ready.
I'm just thinking about being ready, and now I'm ready.
Okay. Everyone, just think about being ready. And let's be ready. Let's start by talking about Wilson and Dixon's article from 2010, their mindfulness classroom attention plan.
Every time you say Wilson Dixon, I think you're going to say Wilson Phillips.
Oh, I keep thinking I'm going to say Mason Dixon.
Amazing.
The Mason Dixon Wilson Phillips line. My mindfulness curriculum.
That's pretty fabulous. So this study gave us an overview of mindfulness, which I'm not going to do again because we just did that. So in this study, they wanted to examine the effects of mindfulness methods on attending in an elementary school classroom. So it was sort of a matter of let's take this down to the elementary level, and then let's look at this specific dependent variable. So they had 12 students that were either in 2nd or 3rd grade, and it said it was at a small private school. So I think those 2 classes were combined. 7 girls and 5 boys, and they were going to try out these mindfulness things. And the dependent variable that they were interested in was attending. And the way they defined attending was, in quotes, the child was engaged in what was occurring at that particular moment in the classroom. But they did go on to kind of give us a little more to go on. So they said that included looking at the teacher, or if another student was talking, looking at the student if they were talking, following an instruction given by the teacher, looking at or working on a worksheet, doing a classroom activity. So all of that they included in their definition of attending. So it was fairly broad, and that was just kind of like the catch-all term for like doing what you were supposed to do in class, basically.
I think it's interesting that they chose attending because when you describe mindfulness, it feels like practicing mindfulness. What you're practicing is your attending skill, your ability to attend to the relevant stimuli in the environment. But so many of the mindfulness-based interventions that had been researched had to do with like decreasing aggressive behavior or decreasing anxiety. So it's so interesting to sort of make that change of like, we use mindfulness, which sounds like something about attending, to do things unrelated, well, seemingly unrelated to attending. But then here they're looking at specifically, no, we're going to use this to increase attending because that's what it seems like mindfulness should do.
I think that's fair, although I do think it's still a leap to say like, well, this is the thing that mindfulness should do, right? Because it's kind of up in the air about what exactly mindfulness should do. But if you had to pick one thing, having it be so that you can now fully participate in the classroom might make sense, right? And the way that they did this was kind of interesting. So they had the students sit in certain seats in the classroom, and they put the boys on one side and the girls on the other side, which I don't think that part was particularly important, but we did get a whole seating chart in the article for who was sitting where and the arrangement of the desks. And the reason why they did this is because it had to do with their measurement system. So they had an observer in the classroom, and they broke it down into 10-second MTS, momentary time sample. And they did it in such a way where they devoted 10 seconds to each student, and then they moved to the next student and the next and the next, all the way through the 12. So what the seating chart was showing us is the way in which the observers went around the room and observed each student. So I don't know, every 2 minutes they saw everyone. I think that's right. Yeah. And it was a 30-minute observation. So everyone got 15 observations each. I think I did the math on that. So it's kind of a cool way to do it. They weren't trying to observe everyone at once, which could have been a disaster. So they have individual data on each of the students, although we only got group data in our final graph. But the way that this was organized was an ABA withdrawal design. And I left them on the A phase, but I guess that's just how things were in 2010. And the A phase was 5 30-minute observations in which nothing special occurred. And they did note, and I liked this, that because in the mindfulness, they were there for 45 minutes in the baseline, they came in and just sat there for 15 minutes and didn't do anything.
They had their own mindful moment while they were waiting.
Exactly. And then they recorded for 30 minutes to kind of account for that reactivity that could have occurred when they first entered into the classroom. So I thought that was a nice way to kind of balance that. So that was the baseline phase. And then in the B phase, they had a 15-minute mindfulness exercise and then 30-minute observation following it. They did lots of IOA. 50% of the sessions had IOA, which means a second observer actually came. And the range, I put that the range was 90 to 110%, but that seems wrong. I think I probably meant to put 100%. Maybe it went all the way to 110, but I'm pretty sure it only went to 100.
It was great IOA.
Okay, so the baseline was as I described. Nothing special was going on. There were like varied academic activities happening during these times. They didn't try to control for that, but it was always some type of like math or science or reading that was occurring.
Good. I love research where the observers are just, we just went to a class. What were they doing? Stuff. Because if you go to a classroom, they're always going to be doing stuff. And if you plan to go and it's reading time, guess what? Today's special day where it's math instead, or there's an assembly, or it's never going to be the controlled lab setting. And I appreciate research that just is like, nope, we're not even going to pretend that that's where we are.
I like that
we're in a real class.
Yeah. So they did that. And then they did the mindfulness intervention phase. And in this phase, they had what amounted to 3 different quote unquote games that they did with the students. And I will walk you through what those were. So it's a bit misleading because the first 2 things are going to tell you actually pair up together to be the first game. So first of all, there was what they called silent game. And in silent game, there were 5 rules you needed to follow. You kind of sort of think of this as like a prerequisite to mindfulness. You had to be able to keep still in your seat, keep your hands to yourself, don't smile or make faces at your neighbor. Remember when we all went to school and had neighbors? Your eyes need to be closed or you need to be looking down and you need to have good posture. So it means you can't be like laying on your desk is what I suspect. And the first time they did this, everyone who stayed in the game got a Hershey kiss, but they only did that on the first day.
Hilariously, when I read this, I'm like, I'm going to try it out with my 3-year-old. Let's play the silent game.
How'd it go?
It was lovely, actually. Hershey kisses are very potent.
Oh, you even used the Hershey kiss?
And I even used the Hershey kiss I was like, I just need silence. It was like nonstop talking all day. I was like, let's play the silent game. It was amazing.
Nice. I bet it works yesterday and not tomorrow.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely not going to work tomorrow. But I also incorporated the next part too.
Oh, okay. Great. That's basically part one of the first game. And then the second part was called breathing exercise. They named these very creatively. And in breathing exercise, you were to focus on your breathing and focus on the cold air coming in through your nose and the warm air going out through your mouth. And everyone liked this. And then they combined silent game and breathing exercise to create silent game 2, which is where you need to follow the rules of silent game, but also focus on your breathing. So that was game 1. And then game 2 was called the noticing self-exercise, in which the teacher walked them through noticing their different body parts and like thinking about how they feel. So like think about how your legs feel. Think about how your feet feel inside your shoes, those types of things. I noted that's kind of like what they do at the end of a yoga session, right? Where you like, they draw your attention to all your different body parts and you relax them.
It's called Savasana.
I was going to say that, but then I thought that would make me sound pretentious.
Yep,
and also,
it did.
Or also,
Congrats.
thank you.
I didn't say it.
Or also dead man's pose.
Yeah.
Dead man's pose.
Where you just lay there.
Where you just lay there.
I did a hot yoga once, and I hated it because I don't like...
You had to wear hot pants.
I had to wear hot pants. It was hot. My feet were sweaty. I don't like my feet touching things. It was just awful. Hated the experience. There was no mindful moment there.
It was not mindful.
No, it was like, think about your body. I'm like, no, yuck. Leaving.
All right, and then the third exercise that they did was called the mindful eating exercise. And this is where they brought in the mandarin oranges. So they said they practiced peeling the oranges together. It took 5 minutes to peel the orange because they talked through it.
Be doing anything to get out of that class. Grab my orange and run.
Right. So they peeled the orange together really slowly and talked about the process of peeling it. And then they ate it together really slowly.
Oh my God, so
they
awful.
Ate like they said, don't eat a whole slice, just eat a little piece of it and think about how the orange feels in the mouth and the act of chewing.
I did this
orange. Too. Today?
Yep.
That's a good idea. I might try this.
It was kind of nice. The eating was a little bit challenging, but we worked on it. And I, again, even though they didn't, I provided a Hershey kiss on slow eating.
Nice. No harm there, right?
Just get one of those chocolate oranges, then you can just double it up. You know?
God, I love those things. They're so good. And then my question that I wasn't super sure on is, did they do each of these every time? They had a 15-minute window. And if it takes like 15 minutes to eat an orange, I can't imagine they did them all.
No, I believe they just went through and they did
it was rotated. It wasn't
games.
Noted as far as like in the graph or anything like that. So I wasn't super sure. And that's all they did. And then they went back to the A phase and collected some more baseline data. And that's it. And then we looked at the group means for the classroom in the A, the B, and the A phase. And they saw differential changes as far as attending behavior in the B phase following the mindfulness exercises. The mean scores for the initial baseline and then return to baseline were both right around 70%. And then the intervention phase, when they had done the mindfulness, the very first session was 60%. We're not sure why. But then after that, the mean was about 90%. And that's pretty darn good, right? So what we don't know is individual scores for the students. I would have loved to see the variation in responding if there were some students who responded better to the mindfulness exercises than others. But we don't necessarily know about that. And then the other piece that they noted was that because they didn't make a plan for what the activities were, it could have been that some activities naturally were more exciting for the kids and produced better attending than others. So I don't know if that first 60% data point maybe was an activity that was not fun, or maybe mindfulness was so fun that it amped everybody up. And it was hard to attend. I don't know. They didn't know.
Can't do my fractions. I got to talk about these mindfulness activities.
Right, it was so exciting to have something new to do. While they defined attending in this broad way that included like basically everything you're supposed to be doing in the class, I do still feel kind of nervous about using attending as our DV that we're like definitely shooting for, as there can be variations in what attending looks like, right? It doesn't always look like just straight up looking at your teacher. Mm-hmm. And that should be separated out from disruptive behavior specifically. But I think kids could be, daydreaming and looking out the window and still be listening, or they could be doodling on their sheet and still be paying attention. And I know that that's maybe a minor point to make here, but I always have that sticky feeling about attending specifically in its use as a dependent variable. So I think that might be a limitation here, although they did define it quite broadly. But if someone were to take this away, I think, and try to replicate this, they would need to keep that broad definition of attending or define it in a different way. And that's it. It was a short and sweet one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm ready to pass the mic.
Well, why don't I go next and talk about the Casson article, which, again, we had discussed on episode 33, but I'm thinking we've done this a lot longer since that first time we talked about it, so I don't think it hurts to come back to it a little bit. I won't spend as much time and detail because, again, it was a replication of the Wilson-Dixon article. So, again, general education, third grade classroom. And really the goal was to look not just at does mindfulness make a change in attending, but does it add to a behavior management system overall? Which is, again, why this was an article that we discussed in our episode on classroom management. So the researchers went into a classroom that had been requested for some support. It was not the most well-behaved class, I suppose. And the researchers worked with the teacher to talk about what are the behaviors of concern in class, made definitions of those, and then also looked at engagement of on-task behaviors, engagement in on-task behaviors as their dependent variable. They used a delayed multiple baseline design across the different teachers who were working with the students. And then they really just looked at behavior intervention package. Did that change student behavior? Then they looked at behavioral intervention plus mindfulness exercises. And while they did use the whole classroom, unlike in Wilson-Dixon, they only focused on 6 target students. So they only had 6 data, well, not 6 data points, but six data lines, and looked at the standard mean difference between the before and after rates of behavior to determine the mean difference of effect size. The intervention was pretty straightforward, sort of, the golden oldies of what's good classroom management, had a transition timer to signal when to move to a new activity. If the students made it to the new activity, the first few days they earned some sort of reward, and then they sort of faded that out. They put together a differential reinforcement package for being on task of the students. They focused on teaching the teachers how to use more positive praise than making negative comments. They used like a clap signal to get everyone's attention. They had visual timers rather than the teachers saying, let's do something quickly. They had, a time on the board that the students would, earn extra time to get a special activity at the end of the day. They had a color-coded system. You can move up and down on your color-coded system to earn, special prizes at the end of the week if you reach the goal. And they did these in, a number of trainings with the teacher. And then they would just sort of do these follow-up, feedback activities with the teacher. And that was really their behavior intervention. So nothing too different than probably what any of us would recommend as sort of some first-line behavioral intervention classroom management systems. Then they added the mindfulness component after that. And for this, they took, again, similar to Wilson-Dixon, took about 15 minutes to do these different mindful activities. And then they did 10 minutes just for the activity and then 5 minutes of reflection afterwards, which, oh man, just doing the 10-minute activity to then be asked to be reflective for the next 5 minutes, I feel like all of a sudden, like that Rob kid, he seemed like he was a really well-behaved. He's the worst behaved kid in the class all of a sudden. What happened? Which actually happened to one of the students in this study. They do the mindfulness activities 2 to 3 times a week. They did each activity about 3 or 4 times during the entirety of the study. And here are some games that they played. So they had the quiet game. The kids would close their eyes. They get praised for being quiet. And then they'd ask the kids how long they think they were. What did they notice during the game? They did deep breathing where they focused on their breath. They did structured breathing, which is different in that they had to follow a metronome and try to breathe along with the metronome. They did an activity called present moment awareness, where they'd put their heads on their desk with their eyes closed, and then they'd sense what they're feeling, what they're hearing, what they can smell, what they can taste. I hope they can't taste very much, but that was one of the questions being asked.
If they can't taste anything, they have COVID.
Oh, too soon.
Sorry.
Oh, man.
But while I'm here, the metronome...
While you're here, are you leaving?
The metronome game, I've played this before when I was at a yoga retreat, and that actually makes me more anxious. Mm-hmm. The sound...
It's so fun.
Tick, is it fast?
Tick, tick, tick.
I assume it's super slow.
It's like this. Tick, 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 tick. And you're supposed to be like... And it's stressful.
Oh, that sounds stressful to me too. Like you'd hyperventilate.
Let's ask our listeners if they want us to make more breathing sounds into the microphone. Maybe do some mindful eating on mic.
I just have always wanted to breathe into a microphone.
Well, I'm going to mindful eat. I'm going to unwrap this candy. Wrinkle, crinkle, crinkle. Make mouth movements. Nom, nom, nom.
Oh, no.
No, you don't like that? They did mindful movement, which it sounds kind of like you were talking about both of you about the yoga, where they do different stretches. They model different stretches for the students, and then the students would follow they imitate the models, and then like, where's your body, and then again, notice your breathing while you do this. And they engaged in all of these activities for the 10 minutes, and then a 5-minute reflection, and then they looked at their on-task behavior. So unlike attending Dinah, this actually did have more of a completing task component. Though on task could also be, I'm sitting here listening to the teacher. So it kind of has some of the same limitations from the Wilson-Dixon. And of their 6 target students in baseline, the kids were mostly on task, though there was a variability. And again, I think you see this in a lot of the research, is very rarely are they looking at the kids and they were doing terrible. And then they did great. It was like they were doing pretty good. And then they did slightly better. So we're not talking about astronomical changes in many cases. With the behavioral intervention package, 5 of the 6 students increased their on-task engagement, whereas 1 stayed about the same. Then they added the mindfulness. They saw even more on-task behavior for 4 of the 6 students than in the previous phase. So again, there was an improvement, though one might have said, well, why would you add the mindfulness? The behavior intervention seems to work pretty well itself, but there was an improvement with the mindfulness added to the behavioral intervention. And then there were 2 kids who actually did worse with the mindfulness. One of them did really well with behavior interventions. And then when they put in the mindfulness, he actually started doing worse. So that's the me of the study, in which I don't like this mindfulness stuff or whatever happened.
Stephen, AKA Rob.
Yeah.
He was like, get me out of here.
They added a self-monitoring for both of these students. And then the one who'd already done well with behavior interventions, which to me, it's like, why didn't you just go back to the behavioral interventions? Why did they add self-monitoring? They're just like adding new treatments to this poor kid who was doing pretty well to start. And I think his baseline was actually pretty high too. And then they made him, keep being a part of all this packaged treatment in which he did progressively worse. He did fine with the self-monitoring, but again, did he need it? He could have just not done the mindfulness, probably done all right. And then the other student who had the self-monitoring, he never really did that much better in any of the conditions. So it did seem, and they discussed mindfulness as having an additive effect. Though again, they didn't test mindfulness alone. Would they have seen such a great response without any behavioral intervention? Because I don't know, if I were a teacher, which would you prefer? Doing the mindfulness activities and getting great on-task results, or doing the behavioral intervention and the mindfulness? I'd probably pick the one where I can just do one of the two. And mindfulness seems a little easier to me than behavioral interventions. But again, we don't know a lot about mindfulness, so who knows? And then again, the same results as I think we've been talking about of, yes, mindfulness seems to work. Why? And it didn't seem to work for all of the kids. One of them was doing great and then did worse with mindfulness. One of them just never seemed to improve with that mindfulness component or the behavioral intervention component, the classroom management component. And, there's a question. Well, was it because during mindfulness, some of the students were getting less social attention, perhaps, so they were engaging in off-task behavior? Or was there some sort of like evocative effect of off-task behavior when mindfulness was in play? They also didn't look at the procedural integrity of the teacher implementation of the behavior management system, which, again, not too germane to tonight's conversation. And then some big questions were, this is nice that we see these positive results, but you're going to run into the same problems regardless of whether it's a behavior management system class-wide or a mindfulness program. In order to assess if it works, you're asking a teacher to then take data, and that's going to be hard to do. Meaning, are these just interventions that get done because someone tells a teacher you have to do something and mindfulness has higher social validity? And then how are we supposed to assess if it's effective when we don't know if it's always going to be effective? How long will it be effective? Will there be maintenance if suddenly, okay, mindfulness is done, kids, we don't do that anymore? Do you still see those improvements last long term, or do we go back to that variable on-task rate of behavior? And like you said, Diana, is on-task even a valuable goal for using these interventions? If that's the only problem you have is I wish my students were on task a little bit more, are you going to put all of these interventions in place? Does it make a significant enough change?
Yeah. I also, a couple things. I would like to see from Stephen's perspective, his opinion on self-monitoring. On both, on mindfulness and self-monitoring, right? To see how he felt, because I think that's an important component here. But also just on the graphs where they didn't need the self-monitoring, the first 4 participants, if I needed to argue that these graphs showed functional control, I might have a tough time.
That's what I was thinking as well. When I looked at them, I was like, oh, like that.
Yeah, there's so many overlapping data points, even between baseline and the initial treatment. And then mean, you could argue that variability is reduced with the mindfulness component for 3 of the 4, but the means are almost the same. Mm. And then there's always the point of just sort of maturation over time and getting, more used to your teacher in the classroom. Like often classrooms are kind of wild and crazy to start with, and then things even out as the year progresses. And I guess I don't know what time of year this was conducted, but it was
a classroom that had already been identified by, I think, the decision makers in the building. The Miss Nelson classroom. It wasn't going hot in that classroom, let's say.
Did they try bringing in Viola Swamp?
Just use aversive control?
Oh, got that.
And corporal punishment? I don't think they did.
It's the swamp. Okay, just checking. Okay. So yeah, interesting study, but I do have questions.
So
questions remain.
It tells us that mindfulness maybe, but I feel like a lot of our studies tell us mindfulness maybe. That's about as far as we get. And perhaps it has to do more with the significance of the results just aren't going to be as impressive for things like on task or attending. You're just not going to see those huge improvements. Whereas perhaps there's been other research in areas like minimizing aggression where, almost any decrease is going to be moving in the right direction. But again, those were the articles that we wanted to discuss for tonight's episode. So again, the focus. All right. Well, we're going to come back, talk a little bit about some more mindfulness in the schools, and then wrap it up with a nice meta-analysis. But why don't we take a mindful moment right now and take a little break? We'll be right back. Get your Hershey Kiss and mindfully eat it while we're gone, okay?
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back talking about mindfulness and mindfulness research. But before we get back to our mindful discussion, I want you to take a mindful moment to hear about ABA Inside Track and its ACE approvedness. By listening to ABA Inside Track, you can earn 1 learning credit. Yes, for this episode. Hooray! All you need to do is finish listening to the episode, go to the website, abainsidetrack.com/getceus. That's GET-CEUS. And put in 2 secret code words. I'm going to give you the first one now. It's curious. CURIOUS. I think mindfulness is curious. I'm curious to hear more. Maybe about the results of a meta-analysis or a study that Jackie will talk about. Curious. So Jackie, I'm curious. Did you hear me? I'm curious. Tell me about this article.
I totally heard you. And one thing that I liked, and I could tie in from your article to my article, so my article is the Black and Fernando article, that reminds me of Ferdinand the book. And I just imagine
about the bull?
That, yeah.
Mindfully Smelling Flowers.
I love that book.
I love that book too. I read the names and I was thinking about mindful. I thought about Ferdinand the book. Just wanted everyone to know where I was going with life right now.
Because he likes to just sit under the cork tree.
Yep. Just
smell the flowers.
Sniffing flowers.
If you're not interested in mindful reading, you could mindfully watch, I believe the Disney short is on Disney Plus.
Ooh,
which we're not getting paid for this plug, but it might be there.
Yeah, well, one thing I liked about what you were talking about in kind of your end piece is that we weren't really sure what the teachers were doing in the classroom. And that's kind of how my article starts off is, teachers have this monumental task of providing safe and educational experience. And then they said combating unruly behavior. That just made me laugh. And I don't know why it did, but unruly just seems funny to say in an article. I giggled a little bit. And
yeah,
I don't know why. And so one thing you said, maybe when people were using the mindfulness strategies, you saw potentially a decrease in challenging behaviors. And then teachers are more likely to implement those proactive strategies when challenging behavior is low because they have the space and time to do so, right? The classroom's all crazy. It's really hard to be proactive because there isn't a moment to be proactive. It's all reactive. And so these authors positive that mindfulness training can help improve potentially classroom behavior in young students. And they cited a few research articles that said that mindfulness training can improve attention and self-regulation, but sample sizes in these studies have been really small and not diverse in socioeconomic status or race. So their purpose was to look at, I love this that they used a mindful schools curriculum, and I looked it up. Mindful Schools, it's mindfulschools.org, and they have educator training, they have school support, they have resources, they have their own podcast, which is crazy.
Did they cite the research that they used to develop their curriculum?
Yes.
That's my first tab I go to whenever someone's like, go check out this resource. I go, where? Let me see your citations.
Yes, they do.
Okay.
They have them there. Mindfulness.org. There's tons of further reading. It's like,
do they have any celebrity endorsements?
3. They have no celebrity endorsements, but they have 3 scores. 3. What do you do when you move the page down? 3 of those page down scrolls. Yeah, that's the word I was thinking of articles in psychology, pediatrics, developmental psychology. So real journals. And so they have this curriculum. And so this specific article looked at evaluating this curriculum, and it's for kindergarten through 5th grade, and it was delivered at a public school in California. And so they evaluated the effectiveness of the curriculum using teacher reports. And then they also wanted to see if adding more sessions during follow-up versus no additional sessions to see if there'd be even a bigger difference. They thought there would be. If they kept going, they thought there might be even a bigger difference if there was a difference. I just thought it was neat that, they took something that already was out there and wanted to see if it was effective. And so also the participants, I feel like I was just telling you like a secret. Also, the participants are really interested in this study because the elementary school self-selected themselves. So they contacted the Masters in Science program that ran this and said, hey, we want to do this study on mindfulness and the Mindful Schools curriculum. Can you help us out? So then the MS program,
they must have a Rob working there.
Right?
I always want to do research in my various school districts I've been in.
Yeah. So, but because they self-selected themselves, the program was provided at no cost, which is kind of awesome because it looks like it could be fairly costly.
It goes way beyond mindfulness in terms of the program itself, like lessons on, what is it, on like self-control and participation in activities. And, paying attention is the first piece, but that's really all we've talked about so far is the looking at the paying attention component.
Right. Well, mindfulness can impact those things, right? So teaching you how to be mindful will help you participate in activities more mindfully.
Will it, though? It seems to. It's purported
to, right?
to.
So that's what they're saying. So this elementary school was in California. It was a public school. The school students within this school were primarily non-white and of low income. They're on their overall test scores, they received a 44 percentile in English and a 59% in math, which didn't seem that bad, but I was like, that's actually okay. I think it's just okay, right? So they collected data from 17 teachers across 17 different classrooms in the elementary school, but they don't actually tell us how many kids were in each classroom. There was 400 and something kids that they took data on. So
wow.
It's a lot.
It's a lot of kids, yeah. 409 students. So they created a rubric. They didn't give us the rubric, which I was a little bit bummed about, to collect data on the 409 students all the way from kindergarten to 6th grade. They had 3 different data collection periods. One immediately before they started the curriculum, one immediately after the curriculum, and then one at 7 weeks out. So each of the 17 classrooms were assigned either just the Mindful Schools curriculum with no additional 7 weeks, or the Mindful Schools curriculum with an additional 7 weeks of sessions. And those additional 7-week sessions were just review sessions, so you didn't learn anything else. So for the first 7 weeks, sessions were 15 minutes. They were held 3 times per week for 5 weeks, and they went over the different parts of this curriculum. And so the MS Plus got 12 weeks, but the last 7 weeks was just 1 time a week. And one thing that's interesting that I'm not sure they didn't explain why. So they used 7 weeks as their, what they did, but the MS curriculum is 8 to 12 weeks. Isn't that interesting? Like they didn't follow the curriculum fully.
I don't remember any explanation whether it was they were focusing on the more mindfulness components of the curriculum. It might have had some other lessons that they didn't think were germane to the study. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's possible. The year was almost over, and you got to get 14 weeks out of the study. So yeah.
Yeah. Another thing that I liked, they brought in 2 teachers that were mindfulness teachers to run the curriculum. So they didn't make the teachers do it all on themselves. One had 3 years of experience, and one had 20 years of experience. I'm thinking, wow, that's a lot of experience on mindfulness, right? 20 years. Whew. But anyway.
Yeah, and also it feels like older than mindfulness is a topic that's
right. Mindfulness research in our field, but I mean, mindfulness has been around forever, right? Buddha.
Mindfulness research though, I couldn't find too many citations. Where are we? 2020? Well, no, this was 2016, 2014. I forget.
So it's around the 2000s.
2016.
So it would have been the really early 80s. They would have started as a mindfulness.
Oh yeah, isn't that funny? That early 80s. Oh yeah, I guess you're right.
I didn't look at any of the Kabat-Zinn articles, so I can't remember their citation dates.
Yeah, but anyway, I just was like, wow, that's a long time. And so prior to the curriculum being run in the class, the teachers were given a 1-hour briefing of what mindfulness is and what are the things they're going to be doing in the classroom. And then they actually participated in the mindfulness activities in the classroom. So when the mindfulness teachers were not there, they asked the teachers to do a 2-minute practice every day, and the students were asked to practice daily, but we don't know if this actually happened or not. So I think that's important. And something is crazy that I thought it was crazy anyway, is that they said that they didn't have to get IRB approval. So they said the school administration and teaching staff approved the study protocol. However, the IRB approval was not required as the intervention was solicited by the school and integrated into regular classroom education. That doesn't seem okay, but
no.
They say the teachers assented to participate in self-reporting data via student evaluation method that was already being implemented by the teachers. But what about the kids? Right? I don't know. I just thought that was what?
But it was a school-wide intervention. I mean, I think that's the case in PBIS studies, everyone's data are included.
Yeah,
right?
No, everyone's data are included here, and you didn't get a choice to not be included. I just was like, wow.
But it is kind of strange that there was no IRB oversight of the procedures.
Right. And I guess because they're following the curriculum, maybe they didn't feel like they needed one. But I was just like, whoa, what? So anyway, so we all know that it's on a rubric. But they used the student behavior rubric by Kinder Associates, LLC. And they assessed 4 categories of teacher-rated behavior, including pay attention. In parentheses, they tried to give us a definition, pays attention all of the time. Who does that?
That was a very helpful definition.
Right? But who does that? Pays attention all the time? Anyway.
Right.
Self-control demonstrates calmness and self-control. I love that the definitions have the word in them. Participation in activities is the 3rd measurement that they were looking at, and their definition was physically engages and participates in all activities. Also seems like a lot. And then the 4th thing is caring and respect for others. So shows care and respect for teachers and fellow students. So those are the 4 behaviors that teachers were measuring each student in their classroom on this rubric 3 different times. In the paper, they do give you what the lesson is, and it's fairly similar to what you guys were talking about. But lesson 2 was body awareness, whole body scan while noting feelings and sensation. Teach anchor word to help stay connected with breath. Discuss and visualize ways to be generous. So that's what you did in week 2. So they have a whole thing about that. And so on the rubric, there was a Likert scale from 0 to 4. And so the higher score means that the students is better. So the students were displaying the skills that the teachers wanted them to. So what they found was that there was within teacher variability, but not between teacher variability. And they felt great about that. They said, okay, like teachers aren't saying everyone's doing awesome or everyone's doing horrible, but they saw generally the same results not between teachers. And so at pre-intervention, both groups, the MS and MS plus group, scored at grade level and similarly across all the behaviors. And then when they ran a Crohn's D and used SPSS, they saw statistical significance across all of the 4 measures at post-intervention across both groups. So the MS and MS plus group had the same curriculum for those first weeks, and they said that everybody did well, and everyone maintained at the 7-week follow-up. So that's pretty nice, right? When you look at the graphs, the mean.
All right.
Yeah, the mean data were saying everyone was still doing great, and the added sessions did not seem to do anything. So they didn't see like a vast increase in, being generous or attending even with the review sessions. But one thing we don't know is if the teachers continued to use the mindfulness training in the classroom, right? So we don't know if the MS minus or the the teachers continued to engage in that curriculum even after the study was done for that room. So we're not sure. And they said that there may have also been a ceiling effect on the rubric that wouldn't show differences between the MS and the MS plus. So if they're adding a 4 for all the students post-intervention, you can't get better than a 4. So they're saying that the Mindful Schools curriculum was really helpful across these 4 behavioral measures. But, right, they didn't actually collect data on real behavior in the classroom. So that would be nice.
Teacher report.
Right? So it's teacher report, and maybe the teachers just like having something different or like having another tool in their toolkit, right? Who knows? Or they asked for it. That's the big thing, right? They asked for this. So if they asked for it, that means that they want to make it work.
What did you call that, Rob? The sunk cost?
The sunk cost fallacy?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's economics term is the idea of like, well, I already paid all this. I did not know. I haven't done a lot of writing in economics theory and macroeconomics, but the idea of, well, I already put this money into it. I have to keep putting more money behind this or more effort behind it when that is not always what is best to do in terms of economic theory. You have to know when to hold them.
Yeah.
Know when to hold them.
Well, another thing that I found interesting is they didn't train the teachers following the curriculum if they thought it was effective. And the Mindful Schools website recommends teacher training. So that was interesting. I'm like, if it went well, why didn't you train them so that then they could do that? Maybe they did and they just didn't write it in the manuscript.
It is tricky because we hear so much about some of the critiques and a lot of the limitations of the mindfulness research are, what is a mindfulness procedure and is it being followed? And so again, that seems to be a question worth answering, and yet we're not seeing a ton of research that's answering that.
Right. Yeah, it wasn't answered here, right? We don't know what the mindfulness teachers did really, and we don't know how the students did really. And we don't know what the teachers were doing when the mindfulness teachers were not there really. We don't know any of those things, but it would be helpful.
But they were happy at the end of it. They felt things were better, which at the end of the day is important.
Yeah, one huge limitation of the study is that they didn't have a control group without the Mindful Schools curriculum. So everyone in the school received Mindful Schools curriculum training. No one didn't. And they said that they did this because they lacked resources and time. So they said that someone should probably do that. And again, the teachers weren't blind to the study. They knew exactly what was going on. So this may demonstrate some reactivity potentially, since it was their report that we're looking at.
Yeah, that seems like a big one right there.
Yeah.
And just to really quickly, I did look up some of the Kabat-Zinn early citations, and they were late 80s was sort of when it seems as if he began publishing on mindfulness. And again, not that he's the only person to ever write about mindfulness, but he is kind of the big name in mindfulness research and the popularity of mindfulness. John Kabat-Zinn.
Okay.
So the 80s is, again, mindfulness around for a long time, but sort of like the idea of modern research in mindfulness probably seems like around the 80s. Right. It was not an exhaustive lit review.
The Mindful Schools curriculum began in 2007 when they found some educators in California found out that a lot of their kids were going through trauma, and they wanted to create a curriculum that could address trauma, according to the website.
Well, it's about time to start wrapping things up. So let's wrap up with a meta-analysis of single case research studies on mindfulness-based interventions for youth. This is the Klingbeil et al. 2016 study, which is continuing a series of meta-analyses. Klingbeil and colleagues talk about some previous meta-analyses that had been done on mindfulness by Zugman and Zinner from 2015 and 2014, respectively, that had looked at either peer-reviewed studies or just studies. All the studies were before 2012 or 2011. And these were studies, mindfulness-based intervention studies on youth. And they kind of, noted similar results in that it does seem like mindfulness, when you look at it statistically, has kind of an effect size, though it's a smaller effect size. It's a little bit bigger for certain measures like psychological symptom measures than, say, attention or mindfulness measures, which is odd because you'd expect the mindfulness measures to have the biggest effects of all, but perhaps not. Some of the better studies kind of got medium effects. Some of the studies had smaller effects. It did seem like the longer you do the dosage of mindfulness treatment, the better the overall outcomes. So again, the Klingbeil group decided, well, let's just look at the single case research, which of course we all love. And I do love that it seems like if you want to publish in mindfulness, you probably should have a Z last name like Zugman, Zinner, Kabat-Zinn. It's like a Dr. Seussian study. In terms of not Z, but Klingbeil et al. So maybe this article won't be as good. I don't know. They looked with their colleagues at single case research studies in which there were mindfulness-based interventions. And they differentiated these into two types, direct or indirect interventions. Direct interventions being the ones we talked about in the studies in which they directly worked with students versus indirect studies where mindfulness activities were done to sort of change a teacher or a parent's functioning, which would then hopefully have some effect on the child. They've both been effective in research, so they didn't differentiate between the two in terms of including or not including any of those types of studies. They also really wanted to look at post-treatment outcomes, which hadn't been talked about as much, maintenance effects, which again was not in any previous meta-analysis that they could find, and are there any differences in samples? Because one of the repeating facts we hear is how little consistency there is in terms of what is mindfulness in terms of this is the procedure we're using for mindfulness. So they did their lit review. They found single case studies. They had about 16 studies in which mindfulness was a primary component, and there was a single case research design. They looked at a lot of sample characteristics of the participants in the study, of the clinicians in the study. And overall, the various studies they had, 10 of them were looking at mindfulness-based interventions for treatments for disruptive behavior, 4 for other outcomes like sports-related anxiety or perceptions of family friendliness. They only really wanted to look at the disruptive behavior studies. So they only had, those 10 studies in the end. All of the studies used a multiple baseline. All of them had maintenance data, which is great because that's what they're trying to find out about. Again, in terms of the rigor of the studies, only 3 of the 10 met the standards of the What Works Clearinghouse. And again, I don't know, how many listeners have looked at what makes a good study outside of sort of, good research design. What is the What Works Clearinghouse, which is a government group, are they going to say has to be a good study? In single case subjects designs, I feel like tend to get kind of a bad rap as not having a very strong design compared to say what's the one I'm thinking of? Randomized control.
Group design?
Yeah, like group design, randomized control design. So that's always kind of an issue. But again, they all met inclusion in the study. But if you wanted to talk about the rigor, not all of them were considered to be the most rigorous they could be. And again, depending on who you're talking about, they might have different reasons for saying a study is or is not rigorous. They looked at effect sizes. They used a kind of a Tau U study, which I'm not going to get into the statistics because our episode's going a bit long. And then they kind of used that to estimate the effect sizes. Some big things to note is that 8 of the studies they were looking at came from one primary researcher, Dr. Singh, who I then looked up, and he is a BCBA-D, a psychologist and a professor of psychology and psychiatry, but also BCBA, which I thought was very interesting. I did not know from the areas of interest or the study of interest, and actually had a book that just came out on classroom mindfulness. Now, the nice thing, even though it's always kind of tricky when you have one researcher doing a lot of research in a subject, he did use a curriculum that had been developed called the Soles of the Feet, which had been created to, for individuals with intellectual disabilities, I believe, from sort of the research I did on it, to decrease aggressive behavior. So they did actually have some published curricula used in this study. And in the end, they were able to get 48 participants and look at the results for 48 participants from 4 to 18 years old. Some of them had intellectual disabilities, some of them had ASD, some of them had ADHD, some of them had no disability type noted. But again, only 4 of those studies used the soles of the feet curriculum. Other ones did sort of just like general training. They did readings, they did different activities, sort of like the other studies we've discussed. And again, most of them took about 8 sessions, though the length of time varied. They were average about 533 minutes for the total intervention package, whatever was used. Some of them taught the activities directly. One of them used teachers, but again, didn't give a lot in the studies as to what was the level of training used for the mindfulness activities. 50% of the studies looked at physical aggression, which again, a lot of the early mindfulness research seems to be around physical aggression, 33% about compliance with requests, and then 17% on task behavior. So studies like the ones we discussed actually were the minority in this meta-analysis. They all use direct observations, which is nice. Some had some kind of secondary dependent variables like, were people using the mindfulness practices? Did people like the mindfulness practices? Which again, most people when asked said, yeah, I like mindfulness. It seems pretty good. But only 2 studies, to your point, Diana, actually asked the youth, hey, what'd you think about this? Mm-hmm. Most of them just asked the teachers, what do you think about this? And there was a pretty decent effect size, was a moderate effect size on disruptive behaviors with a really large maintenance effect, the authors found, in terms of looking at the participants of these studies. 48% of the participants had a positive response during the treatment. 67% had a positive response during the follow-up or the maintenance phase, which I think might, it's not necessarily direct, but might point to the idea of mindfulness as being a skill that you must use. And the more you use it, the better the outcomes over time. But that's not factual. It's correlational. It's not a lot of studies they were looking at either. So you can't really make any giant generalizations here. Age didn't seem to have anything to do with the predictor as a predictor of effectiveness. Surprisingly, students with developmental disabilities actually had better results than students with other behavior disorders or no disability. Again, it wasn't statistically significant finding, but it was an interesting finding. When parents or school staff were the interventionists, they saw larger effect sizes, though again, didn't happen. There weren't that many studies, so we can't speak to the significance of those results. And so overall, the results that the single case designs got were better than some of the previous meta-analyses in terms of moderate versus small to moderate. And again, some of the reasons that there might be better effects in these studies had to do with the fact there was a maintenance component. So mindfulness was being practiced for a lot longer than some of these other studies might have been. So there probably or likely is a connection to how long you practice mindfulness and how good the overall outcomes are, which I think is important to get a definitive answer to, because if you're going to start using these in schools, we want to know, if I do this for like a couple weeks and then never again, am I going to see everything go back to baseline a few weeks later? Or is this something that has to become like school culture? Like we all do this now, we do our mindful moment every single day. It's also hard to say what mindfulness is the best mindfulness, because lots of different people did lots of different things. Possibly structured activities would be better, but not for any research reason in terms of the overall results. That brings us kind of to the end. So let's pull into the dissemination station now that we've had our meta-analysis. So I don't know about all of you, but I think mindfulness is super promising. I'm really excited to see more research about it. Would I say, hey, everybody, let's use mindfulness? I don't know, because many of the research results are promising, though we don't have a lot of replications. Procedures tend to be vague. There's not always a maintenance component, though that does seem to be an improvement. And I think this is something that folks who are researching in mindfulness are starting to comment more on. It's great that we know that mindfulness seems to work, but we need to do more, because the danger of a treatment that seems to work is I think that people use it as long as they feel like it works, because they're not quite sure what are the factors they should be measuring. What are the factors they should be paying close attention to over time? And it does run the risk of having a treatment that is effective wash away over time and stop being used for reasons outside of whether it was or was not a good treatment.
Yeah. And I know, Rob, you said before that you were comparing this to gamification. And I think the parallels there we're just not exactly sure what the behavioral principles are at play here. But to me, this also ties into the conversation we had with Dr. Shane Spiker about self-care. And it's the same thing. It's like self-care seems great. What exactly is it? And what exactly does it do? I'm not totally sure. To me, there is something to be that kind of connects these two, in that the way that he defined self-care was saying, whatever self-care is for you is the thing that brings you back to homeostasis, right? So it's a matter of like finding a way to center yourself and be able to be calm and present. Those elements are the same when you're trying to get at mindfulness as well. So I think that that's helpful, but there's still just the question of, okay, well, let's say we pick a DV that is effective for. How is it effective? I still feel like I don't really know. Like, what is the answer here, right? Are we making modifications to the MO? Are we making changes to, thought pattern with respect to particular environmental stimuli, right? Are we just doing the same thing as the self-care idea where we're kind of like bringing, like everything stops for a minute so that we can just take a moment to stop responding to stressors and then be able to handle situations better? I just don't exactly know. And that would be what I would like to see, is some research that ties it into a behavior analytic framework.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, Jax?
Same. It would be fun. It's like, same, I'm done. That's great. I love the idea of mindfulness. I love the idea of putting mindfulness curriculum in classrooms just for the sake of giving people more skills to slow their bodies down. Right? So, and I would love to see research to back that up. So keep doing it, everyone. Maybe I'll start doing it.
You should do it.
Yeah, I don't have a focus in life, so maybe this will be it.
There are some mindfulness researchers, Jackie, that say you can't do mindfulness unless you actually practice mindfulness. So I feel like you are on the right path because you like these mindfulness activities. I don't think it'll be something I follow because I don't think I can do it. I don't know. Maybe if I publicly announce I'm going to do mindfulness research and therefore must practice mindfulness, that might be the only way I can do it.
2021, Rob, 2021.
Yeah, 2020, I missed the boat.
Yeah, 2021.
Oh, well, that's our kind of our initial talk on mindfulness. And I'm excited that we're, kind of looking ahead. We're going to be doing some episodes that get into a little more of maybe not mindfulness, but some either therapies or treatments that do use mindfulness as a component kind of coming up in the pipeline. So please look forward to those. I know I look forward to those as well, to kind of keep this conversation and review of the research going. And with that, it brings us to the end of our episode. We sure hope you enjoyed it. If you did, why not leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. There are a couple other ways you can get in touch with us. Certainly, you can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, where you can find these episodes posted with links to all of the articles. You can listen or watch these on YouTube. There's not much to watch, but you can certainly listen to these episodes on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. You can follow us on social media. We're pretty much everywhere as ABA Inside Track, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest. If you liked some of our off-task statements, well, why not check out our Patreon, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can join us for bi-monthly social get-togethers with other BCBAs and also with our longer form book club podcast, where we're going to put out 3 of those every year. We have our first one on meaningful differences is out now. It's still out now. We go over 2 hours long. The definitive meaningful differences podcast, I like to say. I don't know if it's true, but I like to say it. That's for sure. And of course, you can always feel free to email us at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. And also, one last thing before we go, make sure to get that second secret code word. It is river, R-I-V-E-R. It's a body of water that sort of moves through the ground, side to side, perhaps, like on a map. You can ride on a river. River. Big thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his editing work, and Hollis Irvin from Sycamore Workshop for his visual designs. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!
Bye.